I got pregnant in 12th grade, and my parents kicked me out of the house in a freezing blizzard. 15 years later, they showed up at my door demanding to meet their grandson. But what they saw shocked them completely. My name is Sloane, and I am 32 years old. Tonight was supposed to be a flawless evening, a very exclusive charity dinner I was hosting for ocean conservation right here in Malibu. Between the clinking crystal glasses and the soft jazz playing over the sound system, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Then the heavy front doors of my estate burst open, and the past walked right into my foyer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The cool ocean breeze swept through the expansive glass walls of my living room, carrying the scent of sea salt and expensive catered appetizers. I wore a simple but sharply tailored emerald green evening gown, standing near the grand piano. My catering staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, offering trays of seared scallops and vintage champagne. It was a perfect California night. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted near the main entrance. I heard my valet, a polite young man named Diego, trying to reason with someone. "You cannot just walk in here, sir. This is a private event," Diego said, his voice echoing slightly. "Get your hands off my suit, you incompetent fool," a harsh, familiar voice barked back. "We belong here." I completely froze up. The champagne glass in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I turned slowly toward the entryway. Pushing past the flustered valet were two people I had not seen in 15 years, my father Richard and my mother Patricia. They looked older, of course, but they carried the exact same suffocating aura of entitlement they always had. Richard wore a stiff navy suit that looked like it had just been pressed for a country club board meeting. Patricia was wrapped in an expensive cashmere shawl, her eyes immediately darting around the room, assessing the wealth of my guests. Before I could signal my private security team to intervene, Patricia spotted me. Her gaze swept over my emerald dress, but instead of recognizing me as the host of this magnificent event, her mind automatically defaulted to the narrative she had constructed for me a decade and a half ago. She marched right up to where I stood. "You have exactly 3 minutes to get those muddy shoes off this hand-woven rug before I call the police," Patricia snapped, pointing a heavily manicured finger at my heels. "I see you are still playing waitress Sloane. Go fetch that bastard child of yours right now. We do not have all night to deal with your mess." The investors standing next to me stopped talking entirely. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. I did not flinch. I did not cry. The scared 17-year-old girl who had begged for mercy in the snow was long dead. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a clinical curiosity. "You burst into a private charity gala just to order me around, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "Do not use that tone with your mother," Richard commanded, stepping forward to flank her. He looked around the breathtaking living room, taking in the panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean and the modern art pieces hanging on the walls. He scoffed, shaking his head with a look of pure disgust. "What kind of people hire you to serve their food? Go get the boy. His grandparents are here to see him." Richard reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. He hastily scribbled on it, tore the slip of paper loose, and threw it onto the polished marble table between us. It was a check for $1,000. "Take this pocket change," Richard ordered, his chin raised in that familiar dictatorial angle. "Take your mistake of a son and go find a cheap motel for the night. We need to use this house for a family photo opportunity tomorrow morning, and we cannot have you tracking your poverty all over the background. We told our friends we rented an exclusive beachfront estate, and you being here ruins the aesthetic." I stared at the piece of paper resting on my marble table. $1,000. 15 years ago, that money would have saved me from sleeping in a freezing bus station. It would have bought prenatal vitamins and warm meals. Instead, they had thrown my suitcase out the front door into a blinding winter storm, telling me my pregnancy was a disease that would infect their pristine social standing. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. I did not rip it up. I simply slid it back across the smooth marble surface, right until it touched his knuckles. "That will not even cover the cost of the champagne you just knocked over when you barged past my valet, Richard," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet room. "And as for my son Leo is not a mistake. He is the best thing that ever happened to me, no thanks to you." Patricia gasped, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You insolent, ungrateful little brat!" Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with malice. "I am going to find the owner of this huge house right now. I will make sure you are fired and blacklisted." Instead, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, tapped a few buttons, and held the glowing device out toward her. I slowly smiled, a very terrifying smile. "Go ahead, Patricia," I whispered. "I will give you her direct line." Before Patricia could snatch the phone from me, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the silence in the foyer. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, we watched a custom black Porsche bypass the valet line and park directly on the circular driveway. The heavy oak doors swung open again. In walked my younger sister Sienna, clinging to the arm of her husband DeAndre. Sienna was 29 and spent her life polishing her status as the flawless golden child of our family. She wore a designer silk dress, screaming newly acquired wealth, while DeAndre carried himself with the hyper-inflated swagger of a Wall Street hedge fund director. He was 32, an African-American financial prodigy who married into my family 5 years ago, and immediately adopted my parents' favorite pastime, which was looking down on me. Sienna did not even bother to greet the confused charity gala guests who were staring at them. She marched straight toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "Look at you, Sloane." Sienna sneered, her eyes raking over my emerald gown. "Still pretending to be something you are not. Mom texted me that you were working some catering gig out here, but I did not expect you to be dressed up like you own the place. Go clock out. We have actual family business to handle." I calmly locked my phone and slipped it back into my clutch. The catering staff, sensing the hostility, discreetly ushered the nearest guests toward the terrace, leaving us isolated in the entryway. "I am not on the clock, Sienna," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And considering you just parked your leased sports car in a fire lane, I suggest you make this quick." DeAndre let out a loud theatrical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He stepped in front of Sienna, puffing out his chest. He deliberately shot his cuff to reveal a massive diamond-encrusted Rolex gleaming under the chandelier. "Listen to the attitude on the broke single mother," DeAndre mocked, shaking his head. "You really have not learned a thing since they kicked you to the curb, have you? You are pushing 33, raising a teenager on minimum wage, and you still want to act like you run the room." DeAndre paced around the foyer, looking at the expensive artwork with undisguised envy. He stopped and pointed a finger at me. "I just closed a $40 million acquisition in Manhattan yesterday, Sloane. $40 million. I am feeling incredibly generous today, so I am going to do you a massive favor. I am going to save you from your own pathetic life." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp legal document, folding it back to reveal a signature line. He slapped it down on the table right next to Richard's insulting check. "We know you cannot afford to put Leo through a decent high school," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You probably cannot afford to feed him properly. Sign this temporary guardianship agreement. Give us legal authority over the boy for the next 3 years. In exchange, I will write a personal check right now for $10,000. That should cover rent at whatever shoebox apartment you hide in." Sienna chimed in, stepping up beside her husband with a triumphant smirk. "It is the best deal you are ever going to get, Sloane. Take the 10 grand and walk away. You were never fit to be a mother anyway. We know you only kept the baby to spite Mom and Dad. Let us fix your mistake." I looked at the guardianship paper. I looked at the $10,000 offer. I looked at the smug faces of my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law. The sheer audacity of their demand hung in the air. They actually believed I was a desperate, destitute woman waiting for their table scraps. I turned away from them and walked over to the mahogany bar cart resting against the far wall. I picked up a crystal tumbler and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The sound of fizzing bubbles filled the space. I took a slow and very deliberate sip before turning back to face DeAndre. A $40 million deal, DeAndre, I asked, tilting my head. He smirked, adjusting his tie. That is right. Wall Street moves fast, but I move faster. I set the crystal glass down with a sharp clink. Funny, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. The Securities and Exchange Commission filings from yesterday morning show something entirely different. They show your flagship fund bleeding 30% of its total liquidity. You did not close a $40 million deal. You lost $40 million in a high-risk squeeze. DeAndre froze. The smug grin vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I took a step closer to him, my eyes locked directly onto his. And that diamond Rolex you keep flashing around like a trophy. I continued, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. The serial number is registered to Crown Jewelers in Midtown Manhattan. Is it a weekend rental, or did you put it on your platinum credit card right before the margin calls hit your accounts this morning? Sienna whipped her head around to look at her husband, her perfect facade cracking. DeAndre, what is she talking about? Sienna demanded, her voice pitching upward in sudden alarm. What margin calls? DeAndre did not answer his wife. He was staring at me, his breathing suddenly shallow and erratic. All the color had completely drained from his face. His hands actually began to tremble at his sides. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with absolute terror. How does a broke single mother know about confidential Wall Street margin calls? DeAndre stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. The heavy silence in the foyer was broken only by the faint sound of the ocean waves crashing against the Malibu shoreline outside. Sienna grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his expensive suit. She demanded to know what I was talking about, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. She yelled at DeAndre to explain the margin calls, to tell her I was making it up. But DeAndre could not speak. The utter terror in his eyes confirmed every word I had just said. He took a slow step backward, distancing himself from the table where his $10,000 check still lay like a pathetic joke. Richard, realizing that his son-in-law had just been mentally completely dismantled, decided he had had enough. My father was a man who lived his entire life believing volume and aggression could solve any problem. He stepped directly between me and DeAndre. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a thick finger at my face, completely ignoring the financial crisis I had just exposed. I do not care what kind of cheap internet hacking tricks you are playing. Richard barked, his voice booming with the authority he used to terrify his corporate employees. You are not going to stand here and disrespect this family. You are a disgrace, Sloane. You have always been a disgrace. Now go upstairs and bring the boy down here immediately. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the vein in his neck pulse with rage. I asked him why on earth I would ever let him anywhere near my son. Because he is my blood! Richard snarled, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He belongs to this family bloodline, and I will not let him be raised by some street trash who does not even know how to hold down a respectable husband. You think you are so smart with your little catered parties and your borrowed dresses, but you are nothing. You are an unfit mother, and I will prove it in front of a judge. Sienna, despite her panic over DeAndre, found a momentary spark of her usual cruelty and nodded along with my father. She crossed her arms tightly, telling me that their lawyers were already on retainer. That is right, Richard continued, puffing his chest out. I have the entire legal team at Gibson and Associates on speed dial. Do you know what they charge per hour, Sloane? More than you make in a year. They will bury you in paperwork until you are begging us to take the boy. I will stand in front of a family court judge and tell them exactly what kind of mother you are. I will tell them you were homeless at 17. I will tell them you lived on the streets and exposed a child to poverty and danger. No judge in the state of California is going to leave a 15-year-old boy in the custody of a woman with a history of teenage vagrancy when he could be living in a gated estate in Bel Air. We will take him from you, Sloane, and you will never see him again. The threat was designed to break me. It was the exact same tactic he had used my entire life, bullying and intimidation backed by his massive bank accounts. But he fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply took a step forward, invading his personal space, until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. "You want to talk about my homelessness, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that carried perfectly across the marble foyer. "You want to bring up the fact that I lived on the streets at 17 in front of a judge? Please do, because I would absolutely love to hear you explain to the court exactly how I ended up on those streets." Richard swallowed hard, but maintained his aggressive stance. "Tell the judge about the blizzard," I continued, never breaking eye contact. "Tell them about the night the temperature dropped below freezing, and you dragged me by my hair to the front door. Tell them how you threw my single suitcase out into the snowbank. Tell them about the ultimatum you gave me. You stood on that massive wrap-around porch of yours and told me that if I did not drive to the clinic the next morning and abort my baby, I was dead to you. You told me a pregnant high school senior would ruin your standing at the country club. You said I was a parasite. You legally disowned me that very night, signing the severance papers yourself so you would not have to pay a dime of medical bills." Sienna looked away suddenly, very interested in the floor. Even DeAndre shifted uncomfortably. "You threw me away to save your tea time at the golf course," I said, taking one more step forward, forcing my father to actually take a step back. "You severed all legal ties to me and my son 15 years ago. You have absolutely no rights to him. You have no legal standing. You are nothing to Leo but a bad story I tell him when he asks why we do not visit his grandparents." Richard opened his mouth, but the furious words died in his throat. He looked completely caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of my response. For the first time in his life, his intimidation tactics had hit a brick wall. That is when Patricia stepped out from behind him. My mother had been watching the exchange with calculated eyes, her designer shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, folded document adorned with official legal seals and blue ribbons. She slapped the heavy packet right on top of the marble table next to the $10,000 check. "You are wrong, Sloane," Patricia said, a wicked, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "We actually do have rights. Your grandfather's trust fund officially unlocked yesterday morning." I stood silently and stared down at the thick parchment packet Patricia had just slammed onto my marble table. The heavy blue ribbons and embossed gold seal of the Harrington family estate glared back at me. Patricia smoothed her cashmere shawl with a sickeningly triumphant smile. She explained that my grandfather, the man who built the family empire from steel and sweat, had established a generational wealth trust before he tragically passed away. It was a massive ironclad vault of money designed to secure the family bloodline for the next century. And it had officially vested exactly 24 hours ago. $50 million! Richard announced, his voice vibrating with a greedy hunger that made my stomach turn. $50 million sitting in a high-yield account, untouched for over 2 decades. But the old man was highly traditional. He wrote an archaic stipulation into the bylaws. The money could not be touched by his children or his grandchildren. It bypassed us completely. The trust was designed to unlock only on the 15th birthday of his first biological great-grandson. Sienna let out a sharp, bitter sound, crossing her arms tightly. I could see absolute rage burning in her eyes. She had done everything right according to my parents' twisted rulebook. She married the flashy Wall Street executive. She hosted the right galas. She produced 3 children for the family photo albums, but she gave birth to 3 daughters. Under the rigid sexist terms of the trust, her girls were invisible. The entire Harrington fortune rested entirely on male genetics. "And Leo just turned 15 yesterday," Patricia said, stepping closer to the table and tapping a manicured fingernail against the legal document. "Your bastard child, the one you refuse to get rid of, is the sole beneficiary of $50 million. He is the only male heir of his generation. The money belongs to him, which means, by extension, it belongs to this family." DeAndre wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, desperate to regain his footing after I had exposed his collapsing hedge fund. He stepped up beside Richard, puffing out his chest again. "A teenager cannot manage that kind of capital, Sloane. He needs experienced financial stewards. The document on the table is a proxy transfer. It grants Richard and me full power of attorney over the trust. We will manage the investments, ensure the taxes are handled, and distribute an appropriate monthly stipend to you and the boy for your living expenses. An appropriate monthly stipend, I repeated, keeping my tone dangerously flat. You mean you are going to drain his $50 million inheritance to plug the massive bleeding holes in your failing hedge fund, DeAndre? And Richard will probably use the rest to cover his over-leveraged commercial real estate loans. You two are completely broke. You did not come here to reunite with your grandson. You came here to rob a 15-year-old boy blind to save yourselves from bankruptcy. Richard slammed his heavily ringed hand down on the marble table, causing the crystal water glasses to violently rattle against each other. You will sign that proxy, Sloane, right now. He roared, his face turning an ugly shade of purple with unbridled fury. You owe this family for the public embarrassment you brought upon us 15 years ago. If you refuse to sign that paper, we will drag you through the most vicious public custody battle this state has ever seen. I will hire a massive team of corporate lawyers to dig up every financial struggle you faced after you left our house. I will paint you as an unstable vagrant who dragged an innocent child through homeless shelters and cheap motels. I will make sure the judge sees you as an unhinged woman who cannot provide basic necessities. We will tie you up in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. You will not stand a chance. Patricia immediately jumped in to play the good cop, her voice shifting into a sickly sweet tone of fake maternal concern. We do not want to do that to you, sweetheart. Just sign the paper. Take the $10,000 DeAndre offered you. We will let you keep custody, and we will send you a nice little check every month. You can finally stop working so hard catering these parties. Just be reasonable. Think about what is best for the boy. He needs his grandfather to protect him. Sienna stepped forward, her perfectly contoured face twisted into an ugly sneer. Just do it, Sloane, she demanded. You do not belong in our world, and you never did. You are a high school dropout who got knocked up. You do not even know what to do with a fraction of that money. You would probably just waste it trying to pretend you are something special. We are the ones who maintained the family legacy while you were out living in the gutter. The money should have been mine anyway. I looked at them standing in my glass-walled room. They were so blinded by greed and their desperate need to maintain their affluent facade that they could not see reality. They thought they had cornered a helpless, frightened teenager. They thought threats of lawyers and custody would make me crumble. I slowly reached out and picked up the thick proxy document. I felt the paper between my fingers. Richard smirked, thinking he had finally won. Patricia sighed in relief. I did not even reach for a pen. Instead, I slowly gripped the top right edge of the thick legal packet with both my hands. I looked directly into my father's triumphant eyes and let out a cold laugh that echoed off the ocean view windows. I pulled my hands apart in one swift, violent motion, ripping the $50 million proxy document completely in half. I dropped the shredded paper pieces right onto his shoes. You really think I need your $50 million? The shredded pieces of the proxy fluttered to the floor, settling over Richard's shoes like dirty snow. Nobody breathed. Richard stared down at the ruined document, his brain unable to process the profound disrespect he had just witnessed. Patricia clutched her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was the $50 million key to their financial salvation, and I had turned it into confetti. It was Sienna who shattered the silence. The veins in her neck bulged as her carefully curated high society facade disintegrated. She let out a sound that was half shriek and half growl, stepping forward with her hands curled into fists. She looked as though she wanted to strike me. You ungrateful bitch! Sienna screamed, her voice echoing off the glass ceilings. You are out of your mind. We offer you the world and you rip it up. You think you can stand in this rich person's house and act like you are better than us. You are catering waitstaff. You are a homeless high school dropout. You do not belong here, and I am done looking at your face. Sienna spun around, frantically searching the expansive room. Her eyes locked onto a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who had just stepped into the foyer through the arched doorway. It was Marcus, the head of my private security detail. He had been monitoring the situation through his earpiece, waiting for my signal. "You there," Sienna yelled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Marcus. "Get over here right now. I am a guest of whoever owns this estate, and this caterer is harassing my family. She just destroyed vital legal documents. Grab her and throw her out onto the street where she belongs. Call the police if you have to. I want her removed immediately." Richard nodded his chest, puffing out again, as he regained a fraction of his lost composure. "You heard my daughter," Richard commanded using his best corporate voice. "Remove this woman and find the homeowner. I need to have a serious conversation with them about the low-class criminal trash they hire to serve their appetizers." Marcus did not rush forward. He did not reach for his radio. He did not even acknowledge Sienna or Richard. He walked at a steady, measured pace across the marble floor, his posture straight. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from where I stood. He clasped his hands behind his back and offered a deep, respectful bow. "Is everything all right here, Miss Sloane?" Marcus asked, his deep baritone voice calm and entirely deferential. "Do you want me to escort these trespassers off your property?" The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of deafening quiet that occurs right after a bomb goes off. Sienna froze, her arms still half extended, pointing into the empty air. The smug, aggressive expression melted off Richard's face, leaving behind a mask of pure confusion. Patricia physically stumbled backward a step, her mouth dropping open in shock. "Your property." Sienna repeated the words, tumbling from her lips as a breathless whisper. "What does he mean, your property? You are a caterer. Mom said you were caterer." I looked at my mother, who was trembling slightly. "I told Patricia that I was hosting an exclusive charity dinner tonight," I corrected, keeping my voice perfectly level. I never once used the word catering. Your elitist brains simply could not comprehend a scenario where I was anything other than hired help. You saw me in a nice dress, and your immediate assumption was that I was serving scallops to the wealthy. I walked past my frozen father and stepped toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the crashing Pacific Ocean. I gestured toward the sweeping panoramic view, the infinity pool illuminated by underwater lights and the manicured terraces stretching to the beach. "I bought this estate last year," I stated clearly, turning back to face my shell-shocked family. $15 million, paid in full. Cash. I am not the maid, Sienna. I am the owner. And right now, you are making a scene at my charity gala." Patricia let out a quiet, choking gasp, raising a shaking hand to cover her mouth. She looked around, taking in the modern art, the imported marble, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of wealth surrounding her. For the first time, she was not looking at the space as a stage for her own superiority. She was looking at it as a monument to my success. The daughter she threw into a blizzard to protect her social standing now owned a piece of real estate that dwarfed the family home. Richard looked like he was going to have a heart attack. His face went pale, his eyes darting frantically from me to Marcus, and then to the shredded proxy resting on his shoes. The realization hit him like a freight train. He could not threaten me with lawyers because I could afford better ones. He could not threaten me with poverty because I was standing in a $15 million fortress. His money, his leverage, his source of power over me was completely useless. But it was DeAndre who finally put the puzzle together. While Sienna and my parents were drowning in their shock, the hedge fund director had been staring at me with terrifying intensity. His eyes were narrowed, his mind racing as he mentally scrolled through the Rolodex of high-powered financial players he monitored daily. He stepped forward, pushing past his wife, his hands shaking. "I know your face," DeAndre whispered, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the ocean. "I saw you. I saw you last month in my Manhattan office. You were on the cover of Forbes magazine." DeAndre's eyes widened in absolute horror as the heavy realization finally hit him. "Wait," he choked out slowly, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "You are the billionaire CEO of Aegis Cyber Defense." The shredded pieces of the proxy fluttered to the marble floor, settling over Richard's expensive leather shoes like dirty snow. Nobody breathed. Richard stared down at the ruined document, his brain completely unable to process the profound disrespect he had just witnessed. Patricia clutched her cashmere shawl so tightly, her knuckles turned white. This was the $50 million key to their financial salvation, and I had just turned it into worthless confetti. It was Sienna who finally shattered the suffocating silence. The veins in her neck bulged as her carefully curated high society facade instantly disintegrated into pure rage. She let out a sound that was half shriek and half growl, stepping forward with her hands curled into tight fists. She looked as though she wanted to physically strike me. "You ungrateful bitch!" Sienna screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the soaring glass ceilings. "You are completely out of your mind. We offer you the world and you rip it up. You think you can stand in this rich person's house and act like you are somehow better than us. You are nothing but catering waitstaff. You are a homeless high school dropout who ruined her entire life. You do not belong here, and I am absolutely done looking at your face." Sienna spun around, frantically searching the expansive room. Her eyes locked onto a broad-shouldered man in a dark tailored suit who had just stepped into the foyer through the arched doorway. It was Marcus, the head of my private security detail. He had been monitoring the situation through his earpiece, waiting for my signal. "You there," Sienna yelled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Marcus. "Get over here right now. I am a guest of whoever owns this magnificent estate, and this caterer is harassing my family. She just destroyed vital legal documents. Grab her and throw her out onto the street where she belongs. Call the police if you have to. I want her removed immediately." Richard nodded his chest, puffing out again, as he regained a fraction of his lost composure. "You heard my daughter," Richard commanded, using his best corporate intimidation voice. "Remove this woman right now, and find the homeowner. I need to have a very serious conversation with them about the low-class criminal trash they hired to serve their appetizers." Marcus did not rush forward to grab me. He did not reach for his radio. He did not even acknowledge Sienna or Richard. He walked at a steady, measured pace across the polished marble floor, his posture perfectly straight. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from where I stood. He clasped his hands behind his back and offered a deep, respectful bow. "Do you want me to escort these trespassers off your property?" Ms. Sloane, Marcus asked, his deep baritone voice calm and entirely deferential. The silence that followed was absolute and incredibly heavy. It was the kind of deafening quiet that occurs right after a bomb drops. Sienna froze, her arm still half extended, pointing into the empty air. The smug, aggressive expression melted off Richard's face, leaving behind a mask of pure, utter confusion. Patricia physically stumbled backward a step, her mouth dropping open in shock. "Your property," Sienna repeated, the words tumbling from her lips as a breathless, shallow whisper. "What does he mean, your property?" "You are a caterer. Mom said you were a caterer." I looked at my mother, who was now trembling slightly. "I told Patricia that I was hosting an exclusive charity dinner tonight," I corrected, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I never once used the word catering. Your elitist brains simply could not comprehend a scenario where I was anything other than hired help. You saw me in a nice dress, and your immediate assumption was that I was serving scallops to the wealthy." I walked past my frozen father and stepped toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the crashing Pacific Ocean. I gestured toward the sweeping panoramic view, the infinity pool illuminated by underwater lights, and the manicured terraces stretching all the way down to the private beach. "I bought this estate last year," I stated, clearly turning back to face my shell-shocked family. I delivered the final blow. $15 million, paid in full, cash. "I am not the maid, Sienna. I am the owner. And right now you are making a scene at my charity gala." Patricia let out a quiet, choking gasp, raising a shaking hand to cover her mouth. She looked around, taking in the modern art, the imported marble, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of wealth surrounding her. For the first time, she was not looking at the space as a stage for her own superiority. She was looking at it as a monument to my success. The daughter she threw into a blizzard to protect her social standing now owned a piece of real estate that completely dwarfed the family home. Richard looked like he was going to have a heart attack. His face went pale, his eyes darting frantically from me to Marcus, and then to the shredded proxy resting on his shoes. The realization hit him like a freight train. He could not threaten me with lawyers because I could afford better ones. He could not threaten me with poverty because I was standing in a $15 million fortress. His money, his leverage, his entire source of power over me was completely useless. But it was DeAndre who finally put the puzzle together. While Sienna and my parents were drowning in their shock, the hedge fund director had been staring at me with terrifying intensity. His eyes were narrowed, his mind racing as he mentally scrolled through the Rolodex of high-powered financial players he monitored daily. He stepped forward, pushing past his wife, his hands shaking. "Wait." DeAndre squinted at me, his eyes wide with sudden recognition. "You are the billionaire CEO of Aegis Cyberdefense." The air in the foyer turned dangerously thin. DeAndre's realization about my identity as the CEO of Aegis Cyberdefense had barely registered with the rest of the family before Leo's comment about Richard's credit score shifted the room's volatile energy. Richard dropped his jaw in silent outrage, but DeAndre, desperate to regain control of a situation spiraling rapidly out of his grasp, redirected his panic toward my son. He took a heavy step toward the glass staircase, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished marble floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Leo, who stood casually 2 steps above him. "Listen to me, you arrogant little punk!" DeAndre spat, his voice cracking under the strain of his crumbling ego. "I do not care what kind of cute computer tricks your mother taught you. You do not speak to us like that. You close that screen right now before I come up there and smash it against the wall." Sienna, emboldened by her husband's sudden show of force, crossed her arms. "You heard him, Leo!" She snapped, her voice shrill. "Show some respect. You are a child talking to a Wall Street director. Shut the toy off and apologize." Leo did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood perfectly still, his fingers resting lightly on the keyboard of his matte black laptop. He looked down at DeAndre with an expression of clinical fascination, as if observing a fascinating but fundamentally flawed insect. The fear that usually paralyzed teenagers in the face of adult aggression simply did not exist in my son. He had watched me build a cybersecurity empire from a single folding table in a cramped studio apartment. Intimidation was a language he outgrew years ago. "I would not do that," DeAndre Leo said, his voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "If I close this laptop right now, the firewall I just patched for your hedge fund collapses entirely." DeAndre stopped dead in his tracks. The aggressive forward momentum of his body halted, as if he had walked straight into an invisible sheet of glass. A collective gasp echoed from my mother and sister, but DeAndre did not even blink at them. His eyes darted from my face back up to Leo. The swagger he had carried into my home just minutes ago evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a buried landmine. "What are you talking about?" DeAndre whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I am talking about the massive illegal data breach your firm suffered exactly 6 days ago," Leo replied smoothly, adjusting his grip on the laptop. "The one where your reckless over-leveraging exposed the personal financial data of 300 high-net-worth clients to a Russian syndicate. The breach you explicitly failed to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission because you knew it would trigger an immediate federal investigation and completely vaporize your precious $40 million deal." Richard turned to DeAndre, his face contorted in shock. "DeAndre, what is the boy talking about?" Richard demanded. "Did your firm have a breach?" DeAndre ignored my father entirely. Sweat was now visibly pouring down his temples, staining the crisp collar of his custom-tailored shirt. His hands shook violently as he stared at the 15-year-old boy standing above him. He knew exactly what Leo was talking about. He knew the devastating legal implications of hiding a breach of that magnitude. But more importantly, he was trying to figure out how a teenager in Malibu possessed highly classified information that only his top executive circle knew. "You guys panicked!" Leo continued, his fingers flying across the keys in a rapid rhythm that made DeAndre flinch. "You bypassed standard federal reporting protocols because you wanted to save your own skin." So instead of calling the authorities, you went to the dark web. You anonymously wired $500,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to a legendary white hat hacker. You begged this independent contractor to quietly patch your bleeding servers, hunt down the compromised packets, and build a secure digital vault around your remaining assets before the feds caught wind of your criminal negligence. You hired someone named Phantom. Sienna let out a sharp, confused laugh. This is ridiculous. DeAndre, tell him this is ridiculous. Tell him you did not hire some internet criminal named Phantom. But DeAndre was hyperventilating. His chest heaved as he stared at Leo, a terrifying realization slowly dawning in his panicked eyes. You cannot be, DeAndre choked out, shaking his head in denial. You are a kid. Phantom is a top-tier contractor. We dealt with a professional. You are just a high school kid. Leo offered a small, razor-sharp smile. He slowly turned his custom-built laptop around, holding the screen out for DeAndre to see. The display glowed with lines of complex encrypted code, specifically detailing the internal architecture of DeAndre's supposedly secure hedge fund servers. Right in the center of the screen, blinking in a vibrant neon green font, was the unmistakable digital signature of the contractor he had hired, Phantom. I am the professional, DeAndre Leo said simply. And your internal security was so pathetic it took me less than 3 hours to rebuild your entire network infrastructure from my bedroom. But in the process of fixing your mess, I also found the hidden ledgers. I saw the shell companies you set up to hide your massive losses. I saw the illegal wire transfers you authorized to cover your tracks. I saw everything you desperately wanted to keep hidden from the authorities. DeAndre staggered backward, gasping for air, as if he had been physically struck. Leo let his fingers hover directly over the enter key. I hold your entire career, your personal freedom, and your massive hedge fund hostage today, DeAndre. One single keystroke from this machine sends it all straight to the federal authorities right this very second. The pristine silence of my foyer was broken only by the ragged breathing of DeAndre. He looked as though all the blood had drained from his body. Sienna stared at him, her perfectly contoured face twisting from haughty arrogance into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The gears in her mind were finally clicking into place. She had spent the last 10 minutes belittling me and boasting about her flawless high society life, while completely unaware that the foundation of her existence was a rotting, crumbling lie. What is he talking about? DeAndre, Sienna demanded, her voice rising an octave to a shrill, piercing pitch. Tell me right now this teenager is lying. Tell me our accounts are fine. DeAndre could not look his wife in the eye. He kept his panicked gaze locked on the glowing screen of Leo's custom-built laptop, terrified that any sudden movement might prompt my son to press the enter key and end his life. DeAndre lifted a trembling hand, wiping a fresh sheet of sweat from his brow, but no words came out. His utter silence was the absolute loudest confession he could have possibly made. You lied to me, Sienna shrieked, lunging forward and shoving DeAndre hard in the chest. Her manicured nails dug into the lapels of his expensive, tailored suit. You told me the hedge fund was experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. You told me the freeze on our black cards was an administrative bank error. You forced me to cancel our summer trip to Aspen because you said you needed to stay close to the office to finalize a corporate merger. You are completely broke. You have been intentionally hiding a massive financial crisis from me for weeks. Sienna, keep your voice down, DeAndre hissed, glancing nervously at Marcus, who still stood motionless a few feet away. We can fix this situation. I am handling it. I just need a little more time to move some capital around. Time? Sienna screamed, batting his shaking hands away as he attempted to placate her fury. You do not have any time. You do not have any capital. You are a complete fraud. I gave up everything to be the perfect corporate wife for you. I hosted your miserable clients. I smiled at your insufferable partners during every single gala. I put up with your constant business trips, and you gambled it all away on reckless illegal trades. You dragged me into this house to beg for money from a teenager to cover up your federal crimes. The immaculate illusion of their perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of us. Sienna was no longer the poised, elegant socialite who had swept into my home demanding respect. She was a desperate, terrified woman watching her status, her wealth, and her carefully constructed identity evaporate. She swung at DeAndre again, her voice cracking as she hurled insults at him, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently a guest in the home of the sister she had just spent years attempting to destroy. DeAndre caught her wrists, his own panic morphing into sudden defensive anger. "Stop acting like a lunatic." "Sienna," he snapped, his corporate veneer entirely gone. "You spent money faster than I could print it. You thought those country club memberships and imported sports cars paid for themselves. You demanded the luxurious lifestyle, so I did what I had to do to maintain the illusion. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim when you were the one demanding a bigger mansion while my fund was bleeding out." I watched them tear each other apart with a cold, detached fascination. For a decade, they had projected an image of absolute superiority, viewing my existence as a shameful stain on the family legacy. Now they were screaming at each other like feral animals, fighting over useless scraps. But I was not about to let them turn my sanctuary into a stage for their pathetic domestic collapse. I stepped forward, placing myself directly between them. My movement was swift and authoritative, instantly silencing their bitter bickering. I kept my posture rigid, and my expression entirely unreadable. I looked down at Sienna, who was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with suppressed rage and fear. "Don't dirty my Italian marble with your marital disputes, Sienna," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously icy register that commanded absolute attention. "You came here to steal from my son because your husband gambled away your lifestyle." Sienna opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer weight of reality crushed whatever insult she had prepared. She looked around the massive foyer, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the priceless art, and the sweeping ocean views. She looked at me standing tall and completely unbothered, wearing a designer dress she could no longer afford. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, humiliating defeat. Patricia had been watching the exchange with wide, horrified eyes. Her perfect family narrative was collapsing faster than she could process. Her successful son-in-law was a complete fraud facing federal prison. Her golden daughter was screaming. And the daughter she had thrown out onto the street was a billionaire tech mogul living in a beachfront fortress. The psychological whiplash was taking a massive toll on her, but Patricia was a survivor above all else. She operated on pure opportunistic instinct, as she realized DeAndre was a lost cause, a rapidly sinking anchor that would pull the family down with him. Patricia made a chillingly calculated pivot. The maternal concern she faked earlier completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory desperation. She abandoned DeAndre without a second glance and turned back to my father, grabbing his arm with claw-like intensity. "Forget DeAndre's failing fund." Patricia hissed, her voice sharp and urgent, cutting through the residual tension in the room right now. "Richard, make the boy sign the trust proxy. We still have the $50 million. Patricia and her sharp voice sliced through the heavy air of the foyer, completely ignoring the collapse of her oldest daughter's marriage. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the money. The revelation that I was a billionaire had not deterred her greed, it had simply shifted her strategy. If I did not need the $50 million from the generational trust, then she and Richard could easily justify taking it for themselves. Richard blinked, shaking off the shock of DeAndre's financial ruin. The survival instinct of a desperate, cornered animal kicked in. He turned his back on his weeping daughter and ruined son-in-law, striding quickly toward the leather briefcase he had dropped on a nearby velvet ottoman. His hands fumbled with the brass clasps, lacking their usual smooth corporate grace. He yanked out a crisp manila folder, tearing it open to reveal a pristine backup copy of the exact same proxy document I had just shredded minutes earlier. He had come prepared for resistance, though he clearly had not anticipated the scale of his current humiliation. Smoothing the thick parchment pages, Richard retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He bypassed me completely and marched straight toward Leo. The 15-year-old boy was still standing on the lower steps of the glass staircase, his laptop closed and tucked under one arm, watching the chaotic adults with a detached clinical observation. Richard stopped at the base of the stairs, forcing his flushed face into a mask of benevolent grandfatherly authority. He held the document out, pressing it against the glass railing, and extended the gold pen toward my son. "Listen to me very carefully." Leo, Richard began, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet manipulation that made my stomach churn. "You are a very smart young man. I can see that. You have an incredible gift with computers just like your mother. But understanding technology is not the same thing as understanding generational wealth. You are 15 years old. You have absolutely no idea how to manage $50 million. This kind of capital requires elite stewardship, international tax strategies, and experienced oversight." Leo looked down at the pen, then up at Richard, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not reach for the gold instrument. He simply waited for the desperate man to finish his pathetic pitch. "Your mother is a very proud woman," Richard continued, stepping closer, trying to invade Leo's personal space to assert dominance. "She has always been rebellious. She ran away from this family because she could not handle our expectations, and she has spent the last 15 years lying to you about who we really are. We never stopped loving her. We never stopped looking for you. But she kept you hidden out of pure spite. She is trying to deny you your birthright right now, simply to punish me. Do not let her stubborn pride cost you your legacy. This money is your birthright, Leo. It belongs to the Harrington bloodline. Sign this proxy, and I swear to you I will personally ensure your future is secure forever. Just sign your name on the bottom line." Richard pushed the gold pen closer, practically pressing it into Leo's chest. Patricia hovered right behind him, nodding vigorously, her hands clasped together in a pantomime of desperate prayer. They honestly believed they could gaslight a teenager who had just hacked into a Wall Street hedge fund server. They thought they could override 15 years of my love and protection with a 30-second speech about a fabricated family legacy. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or mirror the frantic, panicked energy radiating from my parents. I walked toward the staircase with a terrifying, absolute calm. The click of my heels on the Italian marble floor sounded like the ticking of a metronome. I reached out and snatched the gold fountain pen right out of Richard's hand. The sudden, swift motion startled him, causing him to stumble awkwardly backward against Patricia. I stepped onto the first glass stair, placing myself firmly between my father and my son. I held the heavy gold pen between my fingers, feeling its weight before casually tossing it over my shoulder. It clattered noisily onto the floor, rolling away into a corner. "Do not dirty my Italian marble with your pathetic marital disputes, Sienna," I said, not even looking in her direction as she continued to weep near the entryway. "You came here to steal from my son because your husband gambled away your luxurious lifestyle, and you, Dad," I continued, returning my cold gaze to Richard, "you came here to rob a child blind because you over-leveraged your commercial real estate portfolio and the banks are calling in your loans. You do not care about a family legacy. You care about saving your own skin." Richard squared his jaw, his face turning an angry mottled red. "I am the executor of that trust, Sloane. I am your grandfather's named representative. The bylaws clearly state that the money transfers to my management if the heir is under the age of 18. It is an ironclad legal mandate, and no amount of your tech money changes the law. You cannot stop me from taking control of that account." I tilted my head, studying the desperate man standing before me. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. "Did you actually read the full text of Grandfather's will, Dad? Or did you just skim the summary the estate lawyers sent you?" Richard frowned, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "Of course I read it. I read every single word. The vesting clause is standard for a generational wealth transfer." I shook my head slowly. I turned and walked over to my wall safe, unlocking it. I pulled out a thick, sealed, aged envelope. "Grandpa visited me in the hospital the day Leo was born. He knew exactly what you did to me, Dad." The heavy silence in the foyer was deafening. I held the sealed envelope between my fingers, running my thumb over the embossed wax crest of my grandfather's personal attorney. Richard stared at the aged paper as if it were a venomous snake. He swallowed hard, the arrogance bleeding out of his posture, but his stubborn pride refused to yield. "That is impossible," Richard sneered. "Your grandfather was in declining health by the time that boy was born. He was barely lucid. He relied on me for everything." I broke the wax seal with a sharp snap. "He relied on you to manage his manufacturing company, Dad," I corrected smoothly. "He did not rely on you to manage his conscience. When you and Mom threw me out onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes, you told him I had run away. You told him I was an addict who vanished into the night. But he hired a private investigator. He found me recovering in a county hospital holding a newborn baby. He sat by my cot and listened to the actual truth." I pulled the heavy parchment from the envelope, unfolding it with deliberate care. Patricia took a hesitant step forward, her eyes darting between the document and my face. "Richard, what exactly is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with dread. "What did your father do?" "I will tell you exactly what he did," I said, projecting my voice so it echoed against the vaulted ceilings. I held the document up, reading the sharp, elegant legal text. "This is a direct addendum to the primary family trust, specifically addressing the generational wealth transfer intended for my great-grandson Leo. Furthermore, be it known that if the biological grandparents Richard and Patricia Harrington are found to have disowned, endangered, or financially abandoned the mother of the heir, they shall be immediately and permanently stripped of all proxy rights and executor duties regarding this specific trust." Richard lunged forward, his face contorted in absolute fury and reckless desperation. "Give me that document right now," he demanded, swiping blindly at the air between us. "It is a desperate fake you typed up to steal my money." I stepped back, easily avoiding his grasping hands. Leo, who had remained perfectly still on the stairs, finally moved. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a thick binder of certified bank records, and dropped it right at Richard's feet. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel. "It is completely authenticated and legally binding, Dad," I said, watching him stare blankly at the binder on the floor. "Signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed 15 years ago. The restrictive clause is absolutely ironclad. You are legally barred from touching a single cent of this money. You have absolutely no authority, no proxy, and no access." The reality of his disinheritance hung in the air like a guillotine. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if having a heart attack. "But the will requires an executor," Richard stammered, his eyes wide and panicked. "The boy cannot manage the 50 million until he turns 18. The courts demand a designated adult guardian. If I am stripped of my rights, the money goes into a blind state account. You cannot touch it either, Sloane." I smiled, a slow, chilling expression that made my father physically recoil. "You still do not get it, do you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. Grandfather did not leave the money in a blind account. He knew exactly who had the intelligence and the moral compass to manage that fortune. He entrusted the legacy to the only person in this family who built something from nothing. I stepped off the staircase and walked directly up to Richard, closing the distance between us, until I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "I am the sole undisputed executor of the $50 million trust fund," I stated, watching his eyes widen in horror. "I have full unilateral control over every single penny until Leo reaches his 18th birthday. And the most beautiful part of this situation is that I have been the active managing executor for the past 3 years. Ever since grandfather passed away, I have been the one holding the keys. I authorized the aggressive growth strategies. I moved the capital into high-yield tech investments. And I placed the hard freeze on the account the moment you attempted a backdoor transfer this morning." Richard looked as though he had been violently struck. He staggered backward, bumping into the velvet ottoman, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish white. "You have had control for 3 years." He whispered the words, tearing from his throat like jagged glass. "You have been managing the money this whole time." "Yes, Dad," I replied, my tone completely merciless. "I silently controlled the very fortune you were waiting to steal." Richard collapsed onto the ottoman, his legs giving out. He buried his face in his hands, a low, agonizing groan escaping his lips. I watched him realize the catastrophic magnitude of his own hubris. "You assumed you would gain immediate proxy control when grandfather died," I said, circling him like a predator evaluating a wounded prey. "You took out massive commercial loans to cover the failing real estate investments in your corporate portfolio. You used the $50 million trust fund as unverified collateral because you honestly believed you could just quietly drain Leo's account to pay off your own debts before bank auditors noticed. You leveraged money you never possessed." Patricia screamed a horrific, shattered sound. "Richard, tell me she is lying," she shrieked, grabbing his shoulders. "Tell me you did not pledge our personal assets to the commercial lenders." Richard could not speak. He just sat there shivering in his expensive suit, completely broken. I stood over him, projecting absolute total dominance. Patricia's manicured hands dug fiercely into Richard's shoulders, shaking the man who had ruled their family with an iron fist for 4 decades. He did not fight back. The silence in the foyer was replaced by the harsh, ragged sounds of Richard hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically, his face draining to a sickly, translucent gray. He clawed at the collar of his custom dress shirt, popping the top button as if the silk fabric was physically strangling him. Patricia shrieked, her voice stripping away decades of country club refinement to reveal the terrified, opportunistic woman underneath. "Answer me right now. Did you leverage our assets? What is she talking about?" Richard squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling violently on the velvet ottoman. The invincible patriarch was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered fraud. "I had to," he choked out the words, scraping against his throat. The commercial real estate market tanked. Our retail spaces in the city sat empty for 2 years. The traditional lenders refused to refinance the mortgages. They were going to foreclose on everything, Patricia. The family estate, the vacation homes, the downtown high-rises, all of it. Every single thing I spent my entire life building was about to be repossessed by the banks. Patricia stumbled backward, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a sickening realization that her status, her wealth, and her entire identity were built on a crumbling foundation of debt. "How much, Richard?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "How much money do we owe?" Richard kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor, unable to meet the burning gaze of the woman who only loved him for his wealth. $20 million, he confessed, the number falling from his lips like a heavy death sentence. "I took a bridge loan from a private holding company." He continued, his words rushing out in a pathetic stream of excuses. "A hard money lender. It was supposed to be a temporary fix, just to keep the properties afloat until the market rebounded." Sienna, who had been weeping silently in the corner over her own husband's financial ruin, let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. $20 million. You lectured DeAndre about reckless gambling, and you secretly sank our entire family legacy into a $20 million hole. You are both hypocrites. It was a calculated risk. Richard snapped, a brief, pathetic flash of his old arrogance surfacing before instantly collapsing again. The debt matured today. That was the absolute final deadline. If I did not wire the $20 million by close of business today, the holding company had the legal right to seize our entire portfolio and liquidate our personal assets to cover the spread. I just needed the proxy. I just needed to access Leo's trust fund to clear the debt. It was $50 million. I could have paid off the loan, stabilized the company, and replaced the boy's money before he even turned 18. No one would have ever known. I listened to his pathetic justification with a cold, clinical satisfaction. He had not come to my home to reconnect with his estranged daughter or to welcome his grandson into the family fold. He had come to rob a 15-year-old boy, blind to save his own miserable skin. He had intended to drain Leo's future, to patch the holes in his sinking, outdated empire, viewing my son as nothing more than a convenient piggy bank. I turned away from the pathetic sight of my parents turning on each other and walked slowly across the expansive foyer. I ran my fingertips lightly along the polished mahogany lid of my grand piano, the cool, smooth wood grounding me. I leaned casually against the instrument, crossing my arms, as I looked back at the wreckage of the Harrington family. A private holding company, I mused aloud, my voice effortlessly cutting through the sound of Patricia's rising panic. Let me guess. A rather aggressive firm with zero online footprint and a very strict policy against negotiating terms. Richard froze. The ragged rhythm of his hyperventilation hitched in his throat. He slowly looked up from the floor, his eyes locking onto mine with a sudden dawning horror. A firm named Apex Capital I continued, offering a razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. The same shadowy firm that aggressively bought out your original bank debt for pennies on the dollar last month. The firm that immediately sent you a notice of default and explicitly refused to extend your deadline by even a single day. The color did not just drain from Richard's face, it seemed to vanish from his entire existence. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening so far I could see the whites all the way around his pupils. He gripped the edge of the velvet ottoman so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The gold fountain pen he had tried to force upon my son still lay abandoned on the marble floor, a useless relic of a man who suddenly realized he had walked blindly into a meticulously laid trap. How do you know that name? Richard rasped, his voice barely a breath. Apex Capital is a shell corporation. They operate through blind trusts and proxy lawyers. My own private investigators could not find out who controlled the board. How could you possibly know the name of my lender? Patricia stopped her frantic pacing. Sienna and DeAndre fell completely silent. The entire foyer seemed to hold its breath as they all stared at me, the discarded daughter standing casually against her piano, holding the absolute power of their destruction. I let the silence stretch, letting the terror marinate in my father's chest. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating helplessness I had felt 15 years ago when he threw me out into the freezing rain. They operate through blind trusts to ensure complete anonymity for their primary investors. I explained, my tone light, conversational, and utterly lethal. It is a very effective strategy when you want to acquire distressed assets without alerting the market or the prey. Richard began to shake again, this time not from panic, but from a bone-deep, paralyzing terror. He stared at me as if looking at a ghost. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in frantic denial. "No, that is not possible. You run a tech company. You do not deal in commercial real estate. I deal in whatever yields the highest return on my investment." "Dad," I said, my smile vanishing completely, leaving behind a cold, hard mask of absolute authority. "And destroying your empire was the best investment I ever made." I pushed off the piano and took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I am the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Capital. I bought your failing debt last month. I denied your request for an extension. I cornered you into coming here today to try and steal from my son. Every single one of your precious assets is currently sitting on my desk, awaiting liquidation." I tilted my head, delivering the final fatal blow. "I own your debt, Richard. I own your company. I own your house. I own you." My final words snuffed out the last embers of Richard Harrington's pride. He did not move or speak, staring at the floor, a hollow shell of the tyrant who once ruled our family. Patricia operated on pure survival instinct. The moment she processed that I was the architect of their financial annihilation, her demeanor underwent a grotesque transformation. The haughty arrogance she had worn like a second skin melted away. Her posture crumbled. The rigid line of her spine bowed and her impeccably styled facade shattered. A woman who had never bowed to anyone in her privileged existence slowly sank to her knees in my foyer. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her. She looked up, her eyes swimming with desperate tears she commanded at will. Her hands reached out toward me, palms turned upward in a pathetic pantomime of maternal affection. "Sloane, my darling girl," Patricia sobbed, her voice trembling with a manufactured vulnerability. "You have to understand, we never stopped loving you, not for a single day." I looked down, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just a clinical observation of a narcissist deploying her final weapon. "You are brilliant, Sloane," Patricia continued, her tears spilling over powdered cheeks. "Look at the empire you created. You are stronger than your father. You are stronger than all of us. But you never would have achieved this greatness if we coddled you. We knew you had fire inside you. We knew you were destined for incredible things. She crawled forward, her diamond bracelets clinking softly. When we asked you to leave that night, it was the hardest thing a mother could ever do. Patricia wept, her voice breaking with practiced precision. It broke my heart to watch you walk out that door. But I knew keeping you under your father's strict rules would stifle your potential. I knew you needed to be pushed out of the nest so you could learn to fly. We did it to make you strong, Sloane. Everything we did was out of love. We gave you the greatest gift a parent can give. We gave you independence. The sheer audacity of her historical revisionism was almost breathtaking. Patricia genuinely believed that if she cried hard enough and framed her cruelty as some twisted maternal sacrifice, I would suddenly forget the reality of my own lived experience. She thought she could erase 15 years of abandonment with carefully delivered tears and a plea to family loyalty. I looked down at her outstretched hands. I did not move an inch to bridge the gap between us. My expression remained entirely devoid of empathy, a blank, impenetrable wall that refused to reflect her fake sorrow. "You did not push me out of the nest, Patricia," I said, my voice slicing through her performance with surgical precision. "You threw me into oncoming traffic and hoped I would get run over." Patricia gasped, recoiling slightly as if I had physically struck her, but I did not let her interrupt. I stepped closer, forcing her to crane her neck backward to maintain eye contact. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending that night was an act of tough love." I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous, chilling quiet. "I remember exactly what happened when I stood in your pristine living room, terrified and alone, holding a positive pregnancy test. You did not look at me with maternal hope. You did not talk about building my character. You told me I was a disease. You looked at my stomach and told me my baby was a parasite that would ruin the Harrington name. You commanded me to terminate my pregnancy to erase my son from existence, so you would not have to suffer the social embarrassment of an unwed teenage mother at your precious country club galas." Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head rapidly from side to side. "No, Sloane, please," she whimpered. "I was scared for you. I was just trying to protect our family reputation." "You were protecting your own ego," I corrected sharply. "And when I refused to destroy my child, you packed my belongings into a black trash bag and locked the deadbolt behind me. You left me on the street with $20 in my pocket during a freezing rainstorm. You did not love me, Patricia. You have never loved me, and you certainly do not love me right now. You love the $50 million sitting in my bank account. You love the fact that I hold the deed to your house. You are only on your knees because you realize your credit cards are going to decline tomorrow morning, and you are absolutely terrified of becoming the very same poor, discarded trash you told me I was destined to be." Patricia let out a loud, deeply agonizing wail, collapsing forward until her hands slapped flat against the marble floor. She wept openly, violently, realizing that her ultimate manipulation tactic had failed completely. The maternal card had been played and burned to ash. She had no leverage left. Sienna, who had been watching this exchange with mounting terror, suddenly sprang forward. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her shoulders. Her husband was a fraud facing federal prison. Her father was bankrupt. Her mother was sobbing on the floor. Sienna had no safety net left. Her entire world was collapsing, and I was the only person standing in the wreckage with a lifeline. Sienna rushed toward me, her face pale and streaked with ruined makeup. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my skin with desperate, frantic strength. "We are blood, Sloane!" Sienna pleaded, her voice cracking with pure panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot just take everything away. You proved your point. You won. You are the smart one. You are the successful one. But we are your family. We are blood. You cannot just leave us all completely homeless." I looked down at Sienna's perfectly manicured hands clutching tightly at my forearm. Her diamond rings dug into my skin. I did not flinch. I slowly peeled her fingers off my arm, letting her hand drop. "Blood is a biological fact, Sienna," I stated, my voice completely devoid of warmth. Loyalty is a choice. You and Patricia made your choice 15 years ago when you let Richard throw me out. You do not get to cash in on a biological technicality just because your bank accounts are overdrawn. Sienna stumbled back, her chest heaving. She looked frantically around the massive foyer, seeking a savior. Richard was still a broken shell on the ottoman. Patricia was weeping on the cold Italian marble. There was no rescue coming from them. Then her panicked eyes locked onto the glass staircase. She saw Leo. He was standing perfectly still, observing the total destruction of the Harrington dynasty with detached curiosity. Sienna let out a breathless sob and scrambled toward the stairs. She bypassed me completely, launching herself toward my 15-year-old son. She stopped at the bottom step, gripping the thick glass railing and gazing up at him. She forced a tragic, desperate smile onto her face, attempting to project the warmth of a loving aunt. "Leo, please," Sienna begged, her voice trembling with sickly sweet manipulation. "You are a smart boy. I can see it. You have a good heart. You have to talk to your mother. She is just very angry right now, and anger makes people do terrible things. But we are your family. We are your blood." Leo did not move. He simply looked down at her, his expression completely unreadable. "You have to understand," Sienna continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "We always wanted to know you. We always wanted to be part of your life. Your grandfather just made mistakes, but he is your family. I am your aunt. We can be a real family now. We can spend holidays together. Do not let your mother make a decision she will regret forever. Do not let her destroy your family over a grudge from the past. You are the man of the house now, Leo. You have to be the voice of reason. You cannot let us lose our homes." Sienna reached out her hand, hovering just inches from Leo's knee, waiting for the boy to crumble under the emotional weight of her guilt trip. She fully expected him to act like a normal, vulnerable teenager desperate for validation. She thought she could bypass me by exploiting a child. Leo adjusted the grip on his laptop. He looked at his aunt, his face completely emotionless. He did not look at me for guidance. He simply analyzed the hysterical woman standing below him and delivered his verdict. "My mother worked 3 jobs while feeding me instant noodles," Leo said, his voice steady and utterly devoid of pity. "You went to Paris on Daddy's credit card. I ran the financial projections, Aunt Sienna. You have absolutely zero ROI. You are a toxic asset." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Sienna let out a sharp gasp, recoiling as if physically struck. The manipulative warmth she tried to project shattered instantly. She stared at the 15-year-old boy, realizing with horrifying clarity that he was entirely immune to her theatrics. He was not a naive child searching for connection. He was his mother's son. He saw right through the performance to the ugly truth underneath. "You, Leo," Sienna stammered, her mouth opening and closing. "You are just like her. You are a monster." "No," Aunt Sienna, Leo replied, his tone conversational and polite. "I am just good at math. You bring nothing of value to this partnership, and you carry massive liabilities. Keeping you around would be a terrible business decision." Sienna let out a strangled sob and turned away, burying her face in her hands. She had no moves left. Her husband was financially ruined, her parents were bankrupt, and her nephew had just calculated her worth and found her entirely lacking. Before Sienna could step back, DeAndre moved. He shoved past his weeping wife. His polished corporate veneer had vanished. He was sweating his tie askew, his eyes wide with calculating energy. DeAndre was a hedge fund manager who spent his life assessing risk and cutting losses. He looked at Richard and realized the Harrington ship had hit the bottom. He needed a lifeboat. He marched toward me, ignoring his wife's collapse and Richard's silent agony. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial tone. "Sloane, listen to me," DeAndre said, his hands raised in surrender. "You are a businesswoman. I am a businessman. Let us take the emotion out of this. Richard is done. I see that. You executed a flawless, hostile takeover. I respect the play, but you do not need to sink my firm to complete your victory." I raised an eyebrow, amused by his pivot. "And why exactly would I spare you, DeAndre? You spent a decade living off the wealth Richard stole." "Because I have leverage." DeAndre replied, his eyes darting toward Richard. I know where the bodies are buried, Sloane. I know exactly how Richard leveraged those commercial properties. I know about the offshore accounts he used to hide failing assets from the auditors. I have the internal emails. I have the raw financial data. I can give you everything you need to dismantle him legally and publicly. I will testify. I will hand over the hard drives right now. I will throw him under the bus. I studied the desperate man offering up his father-in-law on a silver platter. And in exchange for this loyalty, DeAndre swallowed hard sweat dripping down his temple. You save my hedge fund. You assume my bad debt just like you did with Richard, but you restructure the terms. You give me a bailout. DeAndre stood in the center of my foyer, sweating through his custom-tailored suit, panting like a dog desperate for a bone. He had completely detached himself from his sobbing wife and his ruined father-in-law. His focus was entirely on me and the $50 million lifeline I controlled. I watched his eyes dart around the room, calculating his odds of survival. He took another step toward me, lowering his voice, though the acoustics of the marble hall carried every treacherous word. Sloane, you know how this business works, DeAndre pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Richard is a sinking ship. He has been hiding his insolvency for years, papering over massive losses with illegal bridge loans and aggressive tax evasion. I have the digital paper trail. I have the hidden ledgers he thought he deleted from the corporate servers. I know the exact routing numbers for his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I can hand you the absolute proof of his felony tax fraud on a silver platter. I will testify against him in federal court. I will give you the nail for his coffin. I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity as I looked at the man who had happily spent the last 10 years living off my grandfather's money while mocking my absence. And what exactly is your asking price for this profound display of familial loyalty, DeAndre? He swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. You assume my bad debt. You use the trust to bail out my hedge fund, restructure the terms so I do not face federal indictment for losing my client's capital. And you have Leo reverse the hack. You have him unfreeze my servers and restore my trading algorithms. Do this, and Richard is yours to destroy. I will walk away clean, and you get your flawless revenge. The sheer audacity of his proposition hung in the air. DeAndre was openly bartering his own family members' freedom for a financial bailout. Before I could even respond to his pathetic offer, a raw, animalistic roar echoed through the foyer. Richard, who had been sitting paralyzed on the velvet ottoman, suddenly snapped. The realization that his own hand-picked son-in-law was eagerly trying to sell him out to the federal government shattered the last remaining fragments of his sanity. The sophisticated elite patriarch of the Harrington family completely vanished. In his place was a wild, cornered beast fighting for its life. You treacherous parasite, Richard screamed, his face turning a violent, mottled purple. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, tackling DeAndre right in the center of the foyer. The sheer force of the impact sent both men crashing onto the hard marble floor. DeAndre let out a sharp yell of surprise and pain as Richard's hands wrapped around his throat. Patricia shrieked, a high-pitched, glass-shattering sound of pure terror, scrambling backward and tripping over the hem of her expensive gown. Sienna, abandoning her tears, threw herself into the melee, grabbing her father's shoulders and trying to pull him off her husband. "Get off him!" Sienna shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Richard's suit jacket. "You are crazy! Let him go!" Richard ignored her entirely, his fingers tightening around DeAndre's neck. "You ate at my table," Richard roared, spit flying from his lips as he shook the younger man. "You spent my money, you lived in the house I bought you, and now you want to hand me over to the feds. I made you, and I will destroy you." DeAndre gagged his face, turning red as he thrashed beneath the older man. He threw a desperate punch, his fist connecting squarely with Richard's jaw. The sickening crack of bone hitting bone echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Richard stumbled back, clutching his face, blood instantly welling on his lip. But he did not stop. He tackled DeAndre again, fists flying in a chaotic, uncoordinated brawl. Patricia crawled across the floor, weeping hysterically, begging them to stop. The scene was an absolute grotesque masterpiece. The elite Harrington family who had spent their entire lives judging the world from their pristine country club balconies, who had looked down on me for working in a diner and raising a child on my own, had completely devolved into a pack of feral animals. They were literally rolling around on my Italian marble floor, beating each other bloody in a desperate, pathetic fight for survival. Leo stood beside me on the staircase, watching the violent spectacle with clinical detachment. He adjusted his glasses, his face completely calm. "You were right about them, Mom," he stated quietly, his eyes tracking his grandfather as Richard landed another clumsy blow on DeAndre's shoulder. "They really are just savages in expensive suits." "Yes, they are," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "And they are making a mess of my floor." I watched them tear each other apart for exactly 1 more minute, allowing the sheer humiliation of their actions to permanently sear itself into their memories. I wanted them to remember this exact moment forever. I wanted them to remember the day their arrogance died. Then I stepped forward and clapped my hands together. Once. The sharp, resounding crack cut through the screaming and the violence like a gunshot. The sound echoed off the walls, demanding absolute obedience. Instantly, the chaos ceased. Richard froze, his fists suspended in the air, chest heaving as he gasped for breath. DeAndre lay beneath him, bleeding from his nose, his custom suit torn and ruined. Sienna and Patricia were frozen in place, their faces streaked with tears and terror. They all turned their heads to look at me, panting like frightened dogs brought to heel. The room fell dead silent. I looked at DeAndre, my expression devoid of mercy. I spoke with a quiet precision, freezing the blood in his veins. "I do not need your evidence, DeAndre. Aegis Cyber Defense already audited Richard's servers." DeAndre stared at me, the blood from his split lip pooling in the corner of his mouth and dripping onto his ruined silk tie. His chest heaved as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of my statement. Aegis Cyber Defense was not just a random security firm. It was the premier digital forensics contractor for the federal government, a company I had acquired 2 years ago. I did not need a desperate, bleeding hedge fund manager to hand me a thumb drive of stolen data. I already owned the entire digital infrastructure of Richard's failing empire. I stepped closer to DeAndre, my heels clicking sharply against the Italian marble. "You thought you were holding the ultimate bargaining chip?" I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You actually believed you could walk into my home, insult my son, demand my money, and then barter your way out of total ruin by throwing my father to the wolves. You are not a master strategist, DeAndre. You are just a parasite who finally ran out of hosts to drain." DeAndre scrambled backward on his hands and knees, moving away from Richard, who was still gasping for air near the velvet ottoman. "Wait!" DeAndre pleaded, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Sloane, please. You have to listen to me. If you do not bail out my fund, the margin calls will trigger a total liquidation by Monday morning. The banks will seize my personal assets. Sienna and I will lose the house. We will lose everything. I can still be useful to you. I can testify. You are not going to be testifying against Richard?" I interrupted, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. "You are going to be far too busy defending yourself." DeAndre froze. The frantic bargaining energy evaporated from his eyes, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. I turned my gaze toward the staircase. Leo was standing perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on his closed laptop. He did not look like a teenager who had just witnessed a violent brawl. He looked like an auditor observing a successful system purge. "Leo," I said evenly without breaking eye contact with DeAndre, "would you mind explaining to your uncle what exactly you were doing inside his hedge fund servers this morning?" Leo descended 2 steps, his expression entirely clinical. "You assumed my intrusion was a simple ransomware attack." Aunt Sienna's husband, Leo, began, not even granting the man the dignity of using his name. "You thought I just locked the firewalls and froze the trading algorithms to cause a temporary liquidity crisis. That was just the diversionary protocol. While your IT department was panicking and trying to bypass the encryption on your front-end servers, I was inside your hidden back-end ledgers, the ones you thought were securely air-gapped. DeAndre stopped breathing. His hands began to visibly shake. "You have been running a highly illegal market manipulation scheme for the past 4 years," Leo stated, rattling off the financial crimes with the bored precision of a seasoned prosecutor. "You have been engaging in aggressive spoofing algorithms to artificially inflate stock prices, executing illegal insider trades, using shell accounts in the Bahamas, and siphoning client capital to cover your own massive gambling debts. You did not just mismanage your fund, you actively defrauded federal regulators and your own investors to the tune of $85 million. The silence in the foyer was absolute. Sienna let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the man she married. She had ignored the warning signs for years, happily spending the stolen millions on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and private jets, choosing willful ignorance over reality. Now reality had arrived in the form of a 15-year-old boy with a laptop. "Fix it." DeAndre choked out, his eyes darting frantically between me and Leo. "Sloane, tell him to fix it. Tell him to wipe the servers. I will do anything you want. I will sign over the firm. I will give you every single asset I have left. Just tell him to erase the data before the regulators see it." I smiled, a slow, merciless expression that made DeAndre physically recoil. "You are missing the fundamental point of this entire exercise," I replied softly. "We did not bring you here to negotiate a buyout. We brought you here to administer the consequences you have evaded for a decade." Leo tapped the sleek silver casing of his laptop. "I am not going to fix your firewall," he said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Because I already finished the data extraction an hour ago. I packaged every single hidden ledger, every illegal trade log, and every encrypted email linking you directly to the spoofing algorithms. I did not just lock you out of your system. I bypassed the internal security protocols and initiated an automated secure file transfer." DeAndre let out a low, whimpering sound, shaking his head in frantic, desperate denial. "No. No, you did not. You are just a kid. You could not possibly bypass the encryption. I forwarded the entire unredacted digital dossier directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission." Leo confirmed, ignoring the man's pathetic denial. "I also copied the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit and the Boston field office of the FBI. The file transfer was completed and time-stamped exactly 4 minutes before you tried to physically assault my grandfather. They already have everything." The words struck DeAndre with the devastating force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty in Leo's voice left no room for doubt or negotiation. The illusion of his elite, untouchable status shattered completely. He was not just a failed hedge fund manager facing bankruptcy. He was a criminal who had just been handed on a silver platter to the federal government. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. DeAndre let out a hollow, agonizing groan. His legs gave out completely. He stumbled backward, his designer shoes slipping on the Italian marble, and collapsed onto the floor. He did not try to catch himself. He lay there in a crumpled, ruined heap, his knees pulled toward his chest, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of his future crashed down upon him. The arrogant, fast-talking financier was dead, replaced by a terrified, broken man waiting for the federal agents to knock on his door. Sienna stood paralyzed, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at the pathetic, whimpering figure of her husband on my floor. The luxurious, shielded life she had always known was evaporating before her very eyes. Her husband was not going to rescue her. He was going to federal prison. Her bank accounts were going to be frozen. Her social status was going to be obliterated in a highly publicized federal indictment. Panic, raw and absolute, seized Sienna's chest. She spun around, desperately seeking the familiar ironclad protection of the parents who had shielded her from consequences her entire life. She turned her tear-streaked face toward Richard and Patricia, opening her mouth to beg her father to use his money, his lawyers, his connections to make this nightmare disappear. But the words died in her throat. She found her mother still kneeling on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands, entirely broken. And she found her father slumped against the velvet ottoman, his face battered, his eyes vacant, completely destroyed. There was no rescue coming. The Harrington dynasty was dead. DeAndre stared at me, blood from his split lip dripping onto his ruined silk tie. Aegis Cyber Defense was not a random security firm. It was the premier digital forensics contractor for the federal government, a company I acquired 2 years ago. I did not need a bleeding hedge fund manager to hand me stolen data. I already owned the infrastructure of Richard's failing empire. I stepped closer, heels clicking sharply against the Italian marble. "You thought you held the ultimate bargaining chip," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "You believed you could insult my son, demand money, and barter your way out of ruin by throwing my father to the wolves. You are not a master strategist. You are a parasite who ran out of hosts." DeAndre scrambled backward. "Wait," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Sloane, please. If you do not bail out my fund, margin calls will trigger a total liquidation by Monday morning. The banks will seize my personal assets. Sienna and I will lose the house. I can still be useful. I will testify. You are not going to be testifying against Richard." I interrupted, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet. "You are going to be far too busy defending yourself." DeAndre froze. The frantic energy evaporated from his eyes, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. I turned toward the staircase. Leo was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on his laptop. He did not look like a teenager. He looked like an auditor observing a purge. "Leo," I said evenly, without breaking eye contact with DeAndre, "would you mind explaining to your uncle what exactly you were doing inside his servers this morning?" Leo descended 2 steps, his expression entirely clinical. "You assumed my intrusion was a simple ransomware attack," Leo began. "You thought I locked the firewalls and froze the trading algorithms to cause a liquidity crisis. That was a diversionary protocol. While your IT department panicked trying to bypass the encryption, I was inside your hidden back-end ledgers." DeAndre stopped breathing. His hands began to visibly shake. "You ran a highly illegal market manipulation scheme for 4 years, Leo stated. You engaged in aggressive spoofing algorithms to artificially inflate stock prices, executed illegal insider trades using shell accounts, and siphoned client capital to cover massive gambling debts. You did not just mismanage your fund. You actively defrauded federal regulators and your own investors out of $85 million. The silence was absolute. Sienna let out a strangled gasp, staring at the man she married. She had ignored the warning signs for years, spending stolen millions on designer clothes and private jets, choosing willful ignorance over reality. Now reality had arrived in the form of a 15-year-old boy. "Fix it!" DeAndre choked out, his eyes darting between me and Leo. "Sloane, tell him to wipe the servers. I will do anything. I will sign over the firm. I will give you every asset I have left. Just erase the data before the regulators see it." I smiled, a slow, merciless expression, making DeAndre physically recoil. "You are missing the fundamental point of this exercise," I replied softly. "We did not bring you here to negotiate a buyout. We brought you here to administer the consequences you have evaded for a decade." Leo tapped the silver casing of his laptop. "I am not going to fix your firewall," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "I finished the data extraction an hour ago. I packaged every hidden ledger illegal trade log and encrypted email linking you to the spoofing algorithms. I bypassed internal security protocols and initiated an automated file transfer." DeAndre let out a low, whimpering sound, shaking his head in frantic denial. "No. No, you did not. You are just a kid. You could not possibly bypass the encryption." I forwarded the entire unredacted digital dossier directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Leo confirmed, ignoring the man's denial. I also copied the IRS and the Boston field office of the FBI. The file transfer was completed 4 minutes before you tried to physically assault my grandfather. They already have everything. The words struck DeAndre with the force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty in Leo's voice left no room for doubt or negotiation. The illusion of his untouchable status shattered completely. He was not just a failed hedge fund manager facing bankruptcy. He was a criminal handed to the federal government. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. DeAndre let out a hollow, agonizing groan. His legs gave out completely. He stumbled backward, his designer shoes slipping on the Italian marble, and collapsed onto the floor. He lay there in a crumpled heap, knees pulled toward his chest, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of his future crashed down upon him. The arrogant financier was dead, replaced by a terrified, broken man, waiting for the federal agents to knock on his door. Sienna stood paralyzed, her breath catching in her throat, as she looked down at the whimpering figure of her husband on my floor. The luxurious, shielded life she had always known was evaporating before her very eyes. Her husband was not going to rescue her. He was going to federal prison. Her bank accounts would be frozen now. Her social status would be obliterated in a publicized federal indictment. Panic, raw and absolute, seized Sienna's chest. She spun around desperately, seeking the familiar protection of the parents who had shielded her from consequences her entire life. She turned her tear-streaked face toward Richard and Patricia, opening her mouth to beg her father to help her to make this nightmare disappear. But the words died in her throat. She found her mother kneeling on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands, entirely broken. She found her father slumped against the ottoman, his face battered, his eyes vacant, destroyed. There was no rescue coming. The dynasty was dead. I looked down at the man who had just invoked the concept of parenthood as a desperate shield. Richard stared up at me, his bruised face contorted in a pathetic display of terror. The foreclosure notice resting on the marble table had finally shattered his impenetrable arrogance, leaving behind a cornered, terrified animal begging for mercy from the very person he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. His pathetic plea hung in the cold, dead silence of the massive foyer, desperate and fragile. "We are your parents." The words felt like physical poison in the air, a grotesque manipulation tactic designed to exploit a bond that had never actually existed. "Do not ever use that word with me again," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling quiet that commanded absolute obedience. "You have no right to speak to me of morality or parenthood. Your entire definition of family is nothing but a cold, narcissistic business transaction. You view children as investments expected to yield a high social return, and the second the investment underperforms, you cut your losses and discard them. You demanded loyalty but never offered protection. You demanded respect but only delivered cruelty. You did not want a daughter, Richard. You wanted a shiny trophy to parade around the country club, and when I tarnished that image, you threw me away without a second thought." I stepped closer, forcing him to crane his neck backward to meet my impenetrable gaze. "Let me explain to you what family actually means," I continued, my words slicing through his delusion with surgical precision. "Family does not pack a black trash bag with cheap clothes and shove a terrified pregnant 17-year-old out the front door. Family does not change the locks and deadbolt the house while their child stands on the porch weeping for shelter. Family does not leave a terrified, completely vulnerable teenager to wander the streets in a freezing winter blizzard with exactly $20 in her pocket, hoping she just disappears so she will not ruin their pristine reputation. Family does not show up 15 years later, pretending to care just to orchestrate a hostile takeover and steal from a child." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head side to side. "We were protecting the Harrington name," he whimpered weakly. "You were protecting your fragile egos," I corrected sharply. "You cared more about the whispered gossip at your dinner parties than you cared about the safety of your own flesh and blood. You threw me into the wilderness without a second thought and fully expected the wolves to finish me off. But you severely underestimated what I was capable of. I did not just survive the wilderness, I conquered it. I built an entire empire with my bare hands, working 3 jobs, going to night school, and raising my son without a single penny of your blood money. You did not build me. My struggles built me. You are not my parents. You are absolutely nothing more than the people who gave me a genetic blueprint. That is where your contribution to my life began and ended." Patricia, who had been weeping silently on the floor, suddenly lunged forward. She scrambled across the polished marble on her hands and knees, ignoring the pain as her designer gown dragged beneath her. The reality of their total financial ruin had finally broken her. They literally had nowhere to sleep tonight. They were officially homeless, facing the exact same fate they had forced upon me 15 years ago. She reached out her fingers, desperately clawing at the hem of my trousers. Her perfectly styled hair fell in wild, disheveled strands around her ruined, tear-streaked face. "Sloane, my darling, please," Patricia sobbed, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "We were wrong. We were so horribly wrong. I see that now. We made a terrible mistake that night, but we can fix it. I promise you we will change. We can go to therapy. We can be the parents you always wanted. You have a beautiful home, and Leo is such a brilliant boy. We can be a real family. Please just give us a second chance. Find it in your heart to forgive us." I stared down at the woman who had birthed me, observing her pathetic performance with absolute detachment. She was not crying for the daughter she had abandoned. She was crying for the bank accounts she had lost. She wanted the cliché ending where the wrong child tearfully embraces her abusers and shares her hard-earned wealth. I slowly reached down and peeled her fingers off my clothing, dropping her hand back onto the cold floor. I took a deliberate step backward, completely removing myself from her physical reach. "You are waiting for me to scream at you, Patricia," I stated, my tone analytical and devoid of emotional heat. "You are waiting for me to rage and cry and tell you how much I hate you. If I hate you, it means you still hold power over me. It means you still matter. But you do not matter. I do not hate you, Patricia. Hate requires passion. Hate requires an emotional investment. I look at you and Richard and I feel absolutely nothing. There is no anger left. There is no sorrow. There is just an empty void where my parents used to be. I am not going to grant you the dramatic absolution you are looking for. I am not going to forgive you. Forgiveness implies a relationship moving forward, and we do not have a relationship. You are just strangers who happen to wander into my house, and you have overstayed your welcome." I lifted my wrist, pulling the cuff of my blazer to look at my watch. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the second hand seemed exceptionally loud in the cavernous room. "You have exactly 60 seconds to vacate my property before I have you arrested for trespassing," I said. Sienna's desperate, silent plea for rescue hung in the heavy air of the foyer, but her parents could offer her no salvation. They could not even save themselves. I shifted my gaze away from the pathetic heap of DeAndre and the trembling, shattered figure of my sister. My eyes locked onto Richard and Patricia. The absolute terror radiating from them was palpable. For my entire life, they had been the untouchable architects of my misery, wielding their wealth and social status like weapons to manipulate control and eventually discard me. They believed their money insulated them from the consequences of their cruelty. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my footsteps echoing against the Italian marble floor with the steady, measured rhythm of a ticking clock. I approached the sleek modern console table that separated us. From the inside pocket of my blazer, I withdrew a single crisp manila folder. I set it down on the smooth surface and opened it, revealing a thick stack of legal documents stamped with official red seals. Richard stared at the folder, his eyes wide and bloodshot from the physical altercation with his son-in-law. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. He knew whatever was inside that folder was meant for him, and the primal fear of a predator who had just realized he was the prey flashed across his battered face. I placed my fingertips on the top document and slid it smoothly across the table until it stopped mere inches from his trembling hands. "Apex Capital," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling clinical detachment. "Does that name ring a bell, Richard?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Of course it does," he rasped, trying and failing to inject some of his usual aristocratic authority into his voice. "It is the private equity firm that bought out the primary mortgage on the Harrington estate and the commercial loans for my downtown properties. They swooped in when the banks got nervous about liquidity. They saved us from default." I smiled, a slow, merciless expression that made the blood drain entirely from his face. "They did not save you, Richard. They trapped you, and they did not swoop in by accident. I acquired Apex Capital 18 months ago through a series of shell companies and offshore trusts. I am Apex Capital. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the base of the velvet ottoman. No, she whimpered, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, that is impossible. It is entirely possible, I corrected, keeping my gaze fixed on Richard. You were so desperate for a cash injection to maintain your ridiculous lifestyle and cover the mounting losses from your failing commercial properties that you did not even bother to properly vet the firm buying your debt. You signed away the collateral rights to everything you own. The Harrington estate, the summer house in Nantucket, the commercial high-rises in the financial district. Every single brick of your empire is legally tied to the loans you took from my company. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. We have not missed a payment, he insisted, his voice rising in panic. We are fully compliant with the restructuring terms. You were compliant, I corrected smoothly, tapping the document resting in front of him. Until yesterday. You violated the core liquidity covenants buried in page 42 of your restructuring agreement. When you authorized the transfer of $3 million to cover Sienna's completely frivolous spending, and DeAndre's desperate margin calls you dropped below the mandated cash reserve threshold. That triggered an immediate non-negotiable default clause. I pointed to the bold red lettering at the top of the page. That is a formal notice of foreclosure. Because you defaulted on the debt owned by Apex Capital, the foreclosure on your primary estate and all associated commercial properties was initiated immediately. It became legally active as of 5:00 p.m. today. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and profound. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of total destruction. The realization of what I had just said slowly worked its way through Richard's fractured mind, dismantling the very foundation of his existence. He was not just broke, he was dispossessed. Patricia let out a guttural, horrifying scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, the sound of a woman watching her entire identity being incinerated. She collapsed onto the marble floor, tearing at her pristine, perfectly styled hair, her manicured nails scratching against the stone. My house! Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical disbelief. You cannot take my house. Where are we supposed to go? Where are we going to sleep tonight? We have nothing. We literally have nowhere to go. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. You are officially homeless, Patricia. I stated, my tone devoid of any empathy. You are going to pack whatever clothes you can carry in a garbage bag, and you are going to walk out into the cold. You are going to experience the exact same terrifying, soul-crushing fate that you forced upon a 17-year-old girl in the middle of a winter blizzard. You threw your pregnant daughter out into the freezing snow because she was an inconvenience to your perfect social image. Now you get to see how the other half lives. Welcome to the real world. There will be no expensive lawyers to magically save you this time. I own the bank, I own the debt, and I own you. Your elite circle of wealthy friends will turn their backs the moment they realize you are entirely, utterly destitute. Richard lunged forward, his face contorted in absolute terror. You can't do this. We are your parents. The massive custom oak doors swung shut on their heavy brass hinges, locking into place with a definitive resounding thud. That single sharp noise echoed through the grand foyer, vibrating against the Italian marble floors and bouncing off the soaring vaulted ceilings. It was the sound of absolute finality. I stood perfectly still in the center of the entrance hall, watching the polished wood grain of the door. On the other side of that impenetrable barrier, 4 broken people were stumbling out into the biting winter air, stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their power. They were facing the exact same bitter cold they had once banished me into, but they lacked the resilience to survive it. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel guilt. As the heavy locking mechanism engaged, sealing them out of my life forever, an incredible wave of peace washed over the room. The oppressive, toxic energy that Richard, Patricia, Sienna, and DeAndre had dragged into my home evaporated completely. The air felt lighter, instantly purified of their manipulation and their desperate clawing greed. The silence that settled over the mansion was not heavy or tragic. It was beautiful. It was the immaculate, serene quiet of a battlefield after a decisive, flawless victory. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, simply breathing in the tranquility of my own fortress. I had spent 15 years building barricades, both financial and emotional, to ensure those people could never hurt me again. Today, the fortress had held. I opened my eyes and turned my attention toward the staircase. Leo was still standing on the landing, bathed in the soft glow of the chandelier overhead. There were no tears in his eyes, no residual shock from witnessing the brutal dismantling of the Harrington dynasty, and absolutely no lingering trauma. He did not need comfort, and I did not need to offer any empty reassurances. We had known exactly what this day would entail, and we had executed our strategy with flawless precision. He looked down at me, and a genuine, relaxed smile broke across his face, melting away the clinical, intimidating auditor persona he had projected just moments earlier. He was just my son again, brilliant, fiercely loyal, and entirely safe. He reached out and smoothly pushed down the silver lid of his laptop, the soft click of the machine shutting down, mirroring the finality of the front doors. He descended the remaining steps with a casual, confident stride, completely unbothered by the chaos that had just unfolded. "Well," Leo announced, his voice steady and remarkably cheerful, "the SEC just confirmed receipt of the files. I received the automated tracking numbers directly to the secure server. DeAndre's personal and corporate assets are officially frozen, pending a full federal audit. He will not be able to access a single penny by the time he reaches the end of the driveway. Sienna will try to use her platinum cards to book a luxury hotel suite tonight, and every single one of them will be declined." I let out a soft, genuine laugh, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy. Impeccable timing as always, Leo. He walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders in a tight, affectionate hug. I held him close, resting my chin against his shoulder, marveling at the remarkable young man he had become. This was the child they had told me would ruin my life. This was the boy they had deemed a shameful burden, a liability that needed to be erased to protect their country club status. Yet here he was, the chief architect of their ultimate downfall, a brilliant technological prodigy who had just easily unraveled a huge corporate fraud scheme entirely before lunch. We pulled away, sharing a look of profound mutual understanding. We did not need to dissect the eviction or analyze Patricia's final desperate tears. We had spent years surviving, fighting, and climbing our way out of the abyss they had discarded us into. We had lived in cramped, unheated apartments, eaten cheap instant meals, and navigated a world designed to crush young single mothers and their children. Every late-night study session, every grueling corporate battle, every calculated investment had been stepping stones leading us to this exact moment. We had forged our bond in the fires of adversity, creating a titanium connection that no amount of Harrington manipulation could ever pierce. We were a team, a completely independent unit that required nothing from the outside world. "Come with me," I said, gesturing toward the formal living room adjacent to the foyer. The room was warm, anchored by a massive stone fireplace where a brilliant fire crackled cheerfully against the hearth. I walked slowly over to the custom wet bar, tucked into the corner of the expansive room, its glass shelves gleaming under the soft recessed lighting. I reached past the vintage bourbons, retrieving an elegant bottle of sparkling apple cider. I grabbed two pristine crystal flutes, setting them delicately on the polished obsidian countertop. The highly satisfying pop of the cork echoed loudly in the quiet room, serving as a festive punctuation mark on the day's truly incredible events. I poured the golden effervescent liquid into the flutes, watching the bubbles rise to the surface in a joyful dance. I handed one glass to Leo, picking up the other for myself. The firelight caught the crystal, casting fractured dancing prisms of light across the walls of the mansion we owned, free and clear. I held my glass up, meeting my son's eyes with absolute clarity and overwhelming pride. "To freedom," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. To the late nights, the hard work, and the absolute refusal to ever let anyone make us feel small again. Leo raised his glass, clinking it gently against mine. To the Empire, he replied, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. The one we built together from the ground up. The weeks and months that followed our confrontation did not bring a dramatic, chaotic fallout. Instead, they brought an absolute, unshakable tranquility. The Harrington dynasty, a towering monument to greed and narcissistic control, had not just crumbled. It had been systematically dismantled, erased from the elite social circles it once dominated. For 15 years, the specter of my parents had lingered in the back of my mind, a dark shadow reminding me of the freezing winter night I was thrown away. But now that shadow was gone. The air in my home felt permanently lighter, completely scrubbed clean of the toxic residue they had always carried with them. Leo and I settled into a beautiful, quiet routine, our lives undisturbed by the frantic, desperate scrambling of the people who had tried to destroy us. We watched from a comfortable distance as the legal and financial mechanisms I had set in motion executed their final devastating protocols. There was no need for further intervention. The trap had been sprung and the consequences were playing out with mathematical certainty. Richard and Patricia Harrington, once the untouchable aristocrats of Boston high society, experienced a fall from grace that was both spectacular and absolute. When the foreclosure on the estate became official, their wealthy friends disappeared instantly. The country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues, and the exclusive dinner party invitations stopped arriving. They were forced to pack whatever belongings they could fit into a few battered suitcases and relocate to a cramped apartment in a deteriorating building on the outskirts of the city. The contrast between their former mansion and their new reality was stark. The walls of their apartment were thin, the plumbing rattled loudly through the night, and the heating system barely functioned during the bitter winter months. Patricia, a woman who had once commanded a staff of housekeepers and chefs, now spent her days scrubbing stained linoleum floors and clipping coupons for discounted groceries. Richard, stripped of his boardroom authority, and his bespoke suits aged 10 years in a matter of months. He spent his time sitting by a drafty window, staring blankly at a brick wall entirely broken by the agonizing realization that his precious legacy had been completely obliterated. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and without their money they were absolutely nothing. DeAndre faced a reckoning that was far more severe than simple financial ruin. The digital dossier Leo had forwarded to the federal authorities initiated an immediate and aggressive investigation into his hedge fund operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission, armed with irrefutable proof of market manipulation and insider trading, moved with unprecedented speed. 2 weeks after our confrontation, DeAndre was formally indicted on 20 counts of federal fraud and wire tampering. The arrest was highly publicized, his panicked face plastered across financial news networks as federal agents escorted him out of his temporary housing in handcuffs. His assets remained permanently frozen, leaving him entirely dependent on an overworked public defender who possessed neither the resources nor the inclination to fight the mountain of digital evidence stacked against him. The arrogant, smooth financier who had once strutted through my foyer demanding a bailout was now facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. With her husband incarcerated and her bank account seized by the federal government, Sienna was violently thrust into a reality she was completely unequipped to handle. The luxury vehicles were repossessed, the designer wardrobes were auctioned off to cover mounting legal fees, and the private jets became a distant, mocking memory. Stripped of the stolen millions she had so happily squandered, Sienna had to face the terrifying prospect of supporting herself and her child with absolutely no marketable skills and no safety net. She eventually secured a retail position at a discount clothing store. The woman who had once spent her afternoons sipping champagne at exclusive boutiques now spent 8 hours a day on her feet folding cheap sweaters and dealing with rude, demanding customers. She lived in a tiny, sparsely furnished apartment, struggling to balance exhausting shift work with the harsh demands of being a single mother. Every time she looked at her aching, blistered feet or checked her meager bank balance, she was forced to remember the choices she had made. She had traded her integrity for the illusion of wealth, and when the illusion shattered, she was left with nothing but the exhausting, unrelenting grind of poverty. People often assume that revenge is about destruction, about causing as much pain as possible to those who wronged you. But true justice, the kind of justice that heals the soul, is entirely different. Taking their money, seizing their properties, and exposing their crimes were necessary steps, but those actions were merely logistical. The ultimate justice, the sweetest and most profound revenge, was not found in their suffering. It was found in my own survival. The greatest triumph was looking into the eyes of the people who had discarded me, who had labeled me a failure and a shameful burden, and proving that they were completely wrong. They had thrown me into the freezing darkness expecting me to perish. Instead, the terrified pregnant teenager they expelled from their home had transformed into the most powerful person in the room. I had built an empire without their name, without their money, and without their conditional love. I had raised a brilliant, compassionate son who possessed more integrity in his little finger than the entire Harrington lineage combined. My existence, my success, and my absolute indifference to their fate was the ultimate punishment. I had not just survived the brutal raging fire they intentionally set. I had become the absolute master of the flame. If your family ever tells you that you are nothing, remember this. A seed planted in the dirt doesn't die. It grows.